Good morning, everybody. Good to see you all. My name is Ewan Leach. I'm the Chief Executive Officer, Scotland's Regeneration Forum. Welcome to in Edinburgh. It's a sunny day after apocalyptic rain for what has felt like an eternity. I hope you aren't suffering from the same drainage problems that me and my neighbours are. But welcome to our People in Place Practitioner Network meeting. Many of you I know will have been to some of our meetings before, and the whole purpose of these events is to look at how public policy is working for communities in places. And we've looked at a wide range of things. We've studied 20-minute neighbourhoods, we've looked at local place plans, we've looked at, most recently, green master planning in Tuch and Fife. And today we are doing a deep dive in kind of one place, again, maybe not a sort of regional place rather than just one neighbourhood as we did in Fife. And today we're looking at a creative placemaking approach to working with communities. So many of you will probably be aware that the SoSE network have been working on a kind of creative placemaking document over the past couple of years. And I think some of you, like me, were at an event, which is probably 18 months ago now, in the drill hall in Dumfries. And then last month, a document was produced in conjunction with SoSE. And so we thought this was an opportunity to have a look in more detail at what the creative placemaking approach meant. But also, I think from our perspective, to know what it really means when working in communities, and so how that kind of creative placemaking works at a grassroots level. And not just as a policy concept, because we all know we can write policy, theory and legislation, and it makes no difference. It's the practice of it that we're all particularly interested in. And so this morning we're having a first session with Catherine Wheeler from the SoSE Network, who's going to introduce the framework and tell us about the development of it. And then we're going to hear from Graham Rooney, who works for the SoSE Network, and Angie Gilmore, who's with Lochside is Families Together in Dumfries and Galloway. So that's us having a look at actually what did it mean in practice in the Lochside community. We'll then have a brief break at about 5 to 11, where you can, it's a comfort break, you can grab a coffee, and then after 10 minutes we'll restart, and we'll have Rob Davison from SoSE, the South of Scotland Enterprise, speaking to us, and we will be hearing about it from their perspective, but really looking at how community wealth building has been woven into this. And I think it's really important that we're having a kind of economic development perspective on a creative placemaking approach, which the people in this room will all no doubt recognise is important, but sometimes it's maybe an overlooked part of the use of creativity in community development. We'll have two Q&As. We'll have a Q&A after we've heard from Catherine, Graham and Angie. And then after Rob's spoken, we'll have another Q&A then. So you can have your questions, you can type your questions in the chat at the side, or you can save your questions and put your hand up, and we'll have a discussion. And it's always nice to have people speak up, so feel free to unmute and raise your hand, unmute, and show us your face as well. So that's all the housekeeping for this morning. I think you're all aware that it is being recorded because you'll have been asked for permission from Zoom as that happens, and the recording gets put online afterwards so that it becomes available to a wider audience. So enough from me. I'm now going to hand over to Catherine Wheeler, who is going to talk us through a creative placemaking approach to working with communities. Catherine, over to you.
Thank you. I've got a bit of a sore throat today, so if I cough or have to suddenly drink water in between talking, that's why. It's great to be here. It's a really interesting group, and it's really interesting for us to be talking within such a variety of people coming from different experiences and expertise. So like Ewan said, we're going to talk a little bit about the creative placemaking approach that the SoSE has been developing. It's very much not ours. It's something, it's at the heart of our practice, but it's something that we've been exploring with others, with those that we work with locally in Dumfries, with those that we work with regionally, but also nationally and internationally. And there's been a considerable amount of sort of shared knowledge and learning and sort of consultation behind this. And so I'm going to start with doing a bit of a sort of sharing of the concept, as well as give a little bit of background of how the SoSE started, because I suppose that really grounds the practice of creative placemaking for us. And then Graham's going to really start to talk about one example of what that can look like in practice, and Angie will join that conversation as well. So let me share screen. Make sure. That good?
All good for us?
Always works in the test and then not the real life. So that's great. So, just to talk a wee bit about the stove quickly. We are a civic and community space right in the heart of Dumfries High Street. We were founded by artists, a small arts collective, and then we've grown into an organization that is absolutely not just artists. We have people from all different sort of sectors and experience, and artists work as part of that core team and also as associate freelancers. But you know, people come from construction backgrounds, finance backgrounds, all sorts of backgrounds. We're a membership organization, and we use creativity as a tool to involve our local community in shaping the future of our town. Fundamentally, that's a commitment to locally led solutions to the challenges of our place. And initially, that was focused on Dumfries High Street. We operate often in the messy areas of co-development and grassroots structures of decision making, where community, arts, culture bump up against place development and regeneration, health, well-being, tourism, even. I think it's important to just put that into the context of our place. For those who don't know, Dumfries is the biggest town in Dumfries and Galloway. It's about 45,000. The second largest is all the way at the other end of the region, which is 80 miles plus long, and that's Stranraer, which is around 13,000. And all the other towns and villages are between sort of 500 to 5,000. So Dumfries is quite an interesting place in the sort of ecology of our region, the infrastructure. Across the region, like many rural and urban places, but particularly rural, we have an aging population, lower than average employment levels, specifically quite a lack of opportunity for young people. And a lot of the communities that we work in are areas of multiple deprivation. So the stove started back in 2011, really as a response to these challenges, particularly to the failing high street of Dumfries town centre initially. Our mission was really to grow a conversation using creative activity, working with artists and non-artists and others to play with possible futures for our place and involve as many people as possible in that. And I think creativity and creative engagement has a particular way of being able to bring people into conversations that often aren't in traditional consultation conversations. Our building was really important as a headquarters for this work, but also as a vital part of building and maintaining sort of relationships with as part of our community. Our first 4 years were really about exploring the possibilities for Dumfries. What could a different type of high street look like? One that better served its local communities. And what really emerged from this work was the need to use our spaces differently, and also the need to find and encourage ways for people to come together and gather, not necessarily around a topic, but to initially just come together and gather. And then through those gatherings, they become the foundation that you can see conversations about place development or the needs and how we address those needs in a place. So, you know, to fast track a little bit, because we were really focused on the town centre, what really emerged from those initial conversations was the idea of a different type of use and living in the high street. And that was where, I'm sure many people have heard of Mid-Steeple Quarter, but that's where the idea for the Mid-Steeple Quarter was really born. After this 4 or 5 years of conversational and creative engagement activity, without an initial outcome or idea of what that would look like, but then it came into this, Mid-Steeple as a quarter as a concept was born as a way of thinking about how we use spaces differently. So in 2017, the Stove launched Mid-Steeple Quarter as an independent community benefit society, which it is now today. And 6 years on, the community of Dumfries own 5 high street buildings. Mid-Steeple Quarter has attracted over 7 million in investment and has nearly completed, due to open very soon, the development of its first building, which includes 7 new flats and 350 square meters of creative enterprise space. So the idea being that there's sort of enterprise and mixed use and space for businesses and things to start up on the bottom floors and then living space on the top floors, because there was only one resident on the Dumfries High Street previously. In total, the master plan for Mid-Steeple Quarter is that there would be 66 new flats, which would bring 200 people into the town. But I think it's really important to say in this story that though Mid-Steeple Quarter is a real flagship of this approach, it's just one outcome of creative engagement and what we're now calling creative placemaking. Others have been, sorry. Others have been the initiation of new groups, enterprises, the support for people to develop skills and professional development and learning pathways, particularly for those who are often less represented in local decision making. For us, particularly also young people and those who have feel marginalized or have been marginalized in their communities, and creating work and opportunities for the cultural sector to really sort of feed this cultural sector that we feel is a real cornerstone of this activity, and platforming community voices in local and regional policy making. So it could be a well-being strategy or a tourism plan, or it could be another new social enterprise starting. It doesn't have to be building based, but is about addressing the needs of the community. And importantly, it's not always about a big project, but it's about creative and community-led visioning. And I often say that we often ask people what they want in a place without playing with those ideas, without testing those ideas, and without continuing to test those ideas. And creative engagement is a real tool for that. So, creative placemaking. We talk about this as using creativity to support community-led change. And this is the space that we now work in, we at the Stove, regionally and sometimes nationally and also internationally. The premise, like I said, is really that communities have the answers to their own problems, and that those problems are better addressed by inspiring and building capacity for local people to take forward solutions for themselves. Partnership and wider partnerships are a really important part of that work, but how are we embedding the skills and the capacity for long-term change to occur? Importantly, it's about valuing the creative engagement, like I said, as a foundation for this work. And I use the word creative engagement and creativity and artists really broadly. It could be about coming together and doing drawing or a creative workshop, but it could also be coming together and cooking or eating, or, an event around watching a football game or playing. It's that's why I tend to use the word creative activity. It's what's that engagement and that ongoing engagement. Oh, I've lost my place. Where did I get to? Yeah, so the creative engagement is really about how we bring people together in a shared journey of exploration within a place. And it's the commitment and the ability, which is sometimes really challenging, to allow that journey to lead the outcome of the work, which may be different from where we started. So this is a diagram from the Creative Placemaking Approach document. And we feel that it's really important for us to enact creative placemaking through our work at the Stove. But it's also really important to put out our learning and articulate that for others. Is that going in and out when my screen goes blank, or can you still see that?
No, we can still see it.
Okay, great. It's just my flickering screen then. Because in putting out that approach for others, then it's not about saying this is the only way of doing it, but it's about sharing that and articulating that so that we can continue to evolve this way of working. So that was really our intention behind the creative placemaking approach document. But it's really hard to say what this work looks like and what it requires and what shape it takes and who's involved, because it's really different depending on the people, the place, and the wider context and the timing of work. So in our articulation of it, we've instead looked at what are the elements, the values, and the principles that guide creative placemaking. There's more detail of this in the document, and there's diagrams for each of those, but I just thought that this principles diagram was maybe a good one to talk through. So like I said, fundamentally, it's about ensuring that the work is led by and for communities, and that actively and the activity and projects benefit them in multiple and long-lasting ways. So that's about really working from the grassroots of a place. The ideas are initiated and led from within communities. But the creative sector and the creative engagement, like I said, is really used to explore and test ideas, and modeling change, but also for ongoing communication and ongoing engagement and review. And I think that's a really important point to note, because often the creative engagement, or even traditionally the way that people often talk about the term creative placemaking, it's only a small part, or we did that, we know what people want, and now we'll go and do it. Actually, creative placemaking, the way that we're describing it and repositioning it, and I've spoken to some leading academics in this field, and they agree that this is the way it's about ongoing iterative processes of communication and creative engagement throughout the whole process, so that people are involved, people are building skills, people are building knowledge, people are feeding in, so that the capacity is grown and the skills and the training and the employment opportunities are embedded in the activity. And I think you can really start to see how this is a community wealth building approach: local procurement, employability, plural ownership of the economy. Rob will talk about that. But it's all within a wider framework. I think this is really important to say. It only really works if it's not in isolation, if it's within a wider framework of partnership working that aligns, where we're aligning agendas, whether that's, a place plan or looking at health and well-being, and we're overcoming barriers, and partners are supporting and enabling these benefits to occur, because barriers and challenges will come at every point of this work. So to give an example, that approach and practice, I'm going to talk a little bit about Northwest Dumfries and our work with LIFT D&G before I hand over to Graham. So just to introduce some of the origins of LIFT, but you can ask Angie about this as well.
LIFT D&G started in 2016 as Lochside Families Together. We were in the paper as being the most deprived area in Dumfries. I think we're like top 3% in Scotland. And it kind of miffed me, because my kids at the time were wee yins growing up, and I didn't want people looking down at them because they came from this underprivileged, deprived area that was run down and nobody ever wanted to attend. So I decided that I was going to make my community better for my children and everybody else's. So we formed a wee group. It ended up snowballing into something huge. The yin thing I absolutely love about Lochside is everybody rallies round and helps each other, and folk, like I said, think this bit's bad, but it actually isn't. It's probably one of the best bits that you could stay. They're actually really quite friendly folk, although if you're an outsider coming in, you might be a bit daunted, but there is actually no need to be, because everybody around here is amazing, and I love Lochside. And I think that's what actually makes LIFT work really well, because everybody does ken how passionate I am about the bit, and they do ken I am here to help. But it's a great community, absolutely brilliant community.
So we could talk for a really long time about the relationship between the stove and Lift and all the different things that Lift do. So this really is just like a tiny little snippet, but hopefully some of that will come out in conversation. But Lift D&G is a community organisation in Lochside, Northwest Dumfries, and the Stove have been working with them in various ways for several years, sort of looking at organisational development and strategic work, a little bit of mentorship, and most recently, we've worked with them as one of the founding partners in a regional creative placemaking project called What We Do Now, where we were really looking to embed and share learning in creative placemaking approaches, but also look at how a network approach, so connecting work across different communities, how we could help each other for the benefit of the individual work that was happening in each place. And you can find out more about that if you go to the whatwedonowscot website. But basically, What We Do Now supported artists and community partners to work together over 12 to 18 months and engage their communities in thinking about new ideas about their place. And in particular, this was in response to COVID and recovery, and in response to the need for the arts and culture sector and communities have been particularly hard hit. So through What We Do Now, Lift started to work with artists Rosie, Alice, and Andy, initiating a program of creative engagement in Lochside, alongside the engagement that they'd already been doing, within looking at the theme of pride and belonging. So quite a loose and broad starting point, but a starting point nonetheless. And they use creative activity to build trust and really entice local people out into spaces and into conversations they'd maybe not previously been part of, around coming together around, among other things, a pop-up tent and tatty oven. Food was a really important part of gathering. There's a lot of food poverty in Lochside. Angie's relationship and Lift's relationship with the community was absolutely fundamental. You could not have brought in artists to do creative engagement if it hadn't been in complete sort of collaboration and synergy with Angie's network and the way that she works and Lift works in Lochside. So the creative placemaking approach here really aimed to connect activity also within the context of what was already happening in Lochside. So there's a Lochside master plan, there's a place plan, housing development with Wheatley. Loads of different parts taking place. I think that the creative engagement and the creative placemaking, the ambition of it is to sort of be the connecting points, the glue that can bring people into the spaces between all those moving parts and to keep, to hopefully really enable them to be leading and be empowered within those spaces. And the job of the partnership work is to make sure that happens. One of the important things that was coming out of this work was the need for new spaces for creativity and culture and gathering in Lochside, places that they could be really proud of. So the What We Do Now team were able to negotiate the gifting and siting of a porta cabin from Wheatley South for Lochside residents and support Lift in developing and resourcing a programme of ongoing creative engagement and activity. And the long-term ambition, I suppose, really is to evidence the need for a new bespoke cultural space for Lochside that Lift would manage and run for their community. And this would be a high-quality cultural space in the heart of their community, a place that people from the outside will want to visit and take part in, and really sort of giving a new message that Lochside is a place to come to rather than leave from. So back to the reason that Lift started in the beginning. So before I hand over to Graham, who can just talk a bit more about, it's easy to go, these are the wonderful outcomes that can come out of this work. But what that really looks like is grueling. It takes a really long time. It's so many different moving parts. And so I think it's important to say that there has to be a commitment to really long-term working and allies in this sort of work. So that's me. I'm going to hand over to Graham to talk about a bit about what that really looked like.
That's great, Kat. And maybe would it be okay just to keep the picture on the screen, right? Keep something while I'm chatting, just to give something else to look at rather than my face, which is always good. So yeah, thanks everybody for the opportunity to talk through the cabin. That was a really solid foundation that Kat gave there. I think some of the key themes that Kat talked about there around the need to have a long-term view and really the power of partnerships, cross-sector partnerships, I think will come through when you hear the story of the cabin. Things happened very quickly towards the end of the pilot, 2022, with the residents' desire to have their own space, and then managed through amazing work with Wheatley Home South to get the Portakabin, and then the Portakabin arrived in Lochside in like July 2022. So you think, brilliant, let's get going. But unfortunately, things didn't really go that quickly from then, because there was a whole raft of things that we hadn't really factored into that side of it. So I'm going to kind of talk you through like a 5-phase program that we've undertaken in the last 2 years. We got the cabin in July 2022, but we're actually only going to be able to launch the cabin in July 2024. So you would think, why would it take 2 years to activate that space? But this is where the sort of partnerships and the positivity and some of those key words you hear about communities all the time, about resilience and innovation and partnerships. This is a real testament to actually this in practice. So phase 1 was actually getting the cabin, and even that in itself, having a housing association who is willing to work with us to find an asset, and then the legal complications of transferring ownership of that asset, transferring the asset over to the site, then giving us a license to occupy the land. All of those things, which would be major barriers, were just pretty seamless in terms of that desire to want that to happen. So phase 1, we got the cabin on site, then we got the license to occupy. Then we had to go through planning application. So that was phase 2, was planning application and the building warrant. Again, we thought that'd be a pretty simple process. Having gone through that, because technically it'd be a public space, we were talking about compostable toilets, renewable light sources, all of those things. But the legalities that are required in order to have a public space that is within regulation is a lot more complex than that. So what came out of the planning application was the need to have hot and cold water off the main supply, have a running toilet off the main sewer, and have an access ramp. And in practical terms, that meant a 10-metre section of water connection, which was through roadways and pavements. We had 60 metres of trench work that we had to do to tie into the main sewer network, and we had to have an access ramp custom made for the design of the space. When we costed that out, that came out at £25,000, and we had a budget at that time of £2,000. So that desire of the long-term view really kicks in at that point, because the easy thing for everybody to do is just to go, well, that's too hard, that's unachievable, we're not going to do it. But working through that placemaking process and that partnerships, what we did, we managed to get into a room with some key players. So we landed Scottish Water as a community benefit partner. Wheatley Home South were in as a community benefit partner. We got SP Energy Networks who are in as a community benefit partner. And we really formed a construction team, basically. The challenge for us, and it might be quite interesting for those with local authority ears that are in the space, there is a pathway, if you like, where some of the contractor tender processes at local authority level have community benefit as part of that. So we thought it'd be quite easy to get somebody to dig a big hole for us to put some pipes in, but actually some of the wording around some of that community benefit in the tender process isn't quite as tight as what it appeared to be. So we were left with a challenge where we didn't have the budget to dig the holes, and the project stalled. But this is where the other aspect of local authority support and some of that wider desire with your team. And what happened was we were approached by our local authority, who told us that there was a funding route coming up through Shared Prosperity, Scottish Government money that came through Dumfries and Galloway Council through Shared Prosperity for capital, and that the cabin would be eligible to go for that. No guarantee of the funding, obviously. So phase 3 was about funding and finance. So we worked on a funded application for Shared Prosperity to get the capital required to dig the trenches and to put the infrastructure in. And delighted to say that we secured that funding. Most of the capital, but we also got a little bit of revenue for Lift to project manage that process. There was something like 8 contractor teams that were needing to be liaised, a whole raft of different work scheduling packages that had to be coordinated. And we landed that in October, November 2023. And really the next 3 months was quite amazing to see this cross-sector partnership. And Pat talked about barriers and talked about how if you get the right people in the right decision-making processes, how barriers can be overcome together. There was no processes or regulations cut. We followed everything by the book, but we were just able to sort of skip some steps in that process and to have experts who would help us navigate those things. So, yeah, we had, like I said, we had Wheatley Home South who gave us labour. We had an electrician, we had a plumber that gave free labour. We had Dumfries and Galloway Roads Department who worked with Scottish Water to undertake road closures, to be able to put to dig up roads, to dig up pavements, all of that sort of stuff with the correct permits in place. We had Scottish Water who did all of their installation free of charge as part of their community benefit. And we got to a point where we had everything installed and it was, we were ready to go to connect the electrics. And this is where one of life's sort of coincidences come in. So sidetrack a wee bit, but it'll make sense. So my wife Dee listens to Desert Island Discs. And she said to me one day, there's a really interesting Desert Island disc. It's the CEO of Octopus Energy. So I listened to this like 4 or 5 months ago. And we had a big challenge with the cabin. Once the mains electric was in, we then had to put an electric meter box to then get the internal fit out. We thought that would just be like, give them a call, get an electric meter in. As a consequence of lockdown, there's a up to 6 month wait to get an electric meter. So cue the life coincidence, when I listened to this Desert Island Disc with the CEO of Octopus, he was very much talking about how his organisation helps community and how he's community minded and all of these things. So cue midnight one night, I emailed the CEO of Octopus Energy and said, Greg, can you help us? These are the challenges. Because of the funding situation, we had 6 weeks to install, get everything signed off, otherwise we'd lose money. And however it happened, I never got an email back from the CEO of Octopus, but within 24 hours, I did get a contact from a girl called Jenna in Octopus Energy. And it turns out Jenna, and she's given me permission to share this, Jenna grew up in care, and drama was her thing, and she grew up in London. She had a very traumatic childhood. She was heading in the wrong direction, and there was a community group in her community who got a hold of her, developed her drama skills. She then went on to university, she graduated, and then she was in Octopus as a graduate training scheme. And this is where the cabin landed, this one person. So we bypassed a 6 month waiting list and we had our electric meter installed in 3 weeks. And then we were able to hit the funding deadline, and then we were able to get our completion certificate, inspection process, snagging, all of that done. And what that did was it instigated this next phase of creative placemaking, where, because it's continually evolving and the community are involved in it, opportunities then started to rise because the cabin was going to be there. It was going to be a live thing. So in October, we decided to go for decided to go for Creative Scotland funding, because we didn't want the space to be activated and then nothing happened. So a sort of pipeline 6-7 months in advance. We went for Creative Scotland funding for a year-long programme, which kind of looks like the cabin being open 4 days a week, artists in residence programmes, Lift running their own programmes, community engagement, Wheatley Homes potentially using that as a sort of consultation space, the local authority potentially using that. And delighted to say that in April, we were granted a £60,000 project. So the first Creative Scotland project, we believe, in North West Dumfries, and also quite a significant, means bringing £60,000 into an area that on paper, top 3% of the SIMD, is just a really phenomenal achievement and a real testament to how all of these partners have played this part in landing that. And this is just the start of it. So phase 4, sign off, and we did a soft launch. So we ran sort of 4 days of workshops in Easter holidays. We had 62 kids through the door in those first 4 days. And now that the space is there, in the next 4 or 5 weeks, we're going to really activate it, turn it into the sort of design that the community had always wanted, and then we'll kick off this year-long programme in July. And I think, just as my sort of finish point to it, you would think, well, 2 years, that's quite a long time for a space to be not used. And if you think back to sort of January 2022, when the community desired this and wanted it, and then through to July 2024, how do you maintain that desire? Because the cabin is a symbol of the community aspiration and their voice, and nothing's happening, and it's empty, and it's sort of fraying away. So that long-term view of that depth of engagement and the continual communication cycle, it wasn't a case of like, oh, the cabin's just there, we're not doing anything about it. So Angie did some really clever things. You would think, a cabin that's empty, it's got no security in it, in a place that does have social issues, that does have challenges because there isn't anything for the kids to do. And that sense of community ownership, I think, is best evidenced through the fact that in the 2 years that that cabin's been empty with no CCTV, there has been 1 break-in to the cabin. And the break-in was a minor one where they poured paint down the toilet and in the sink. And what we've done with that is we've kept that. We've kept that as part of the installation. Angie went round as a group of young people that live in and around the cabin. Angie went and engaged with them and kind of said, look, you're our neighbourhood watch. And Lift runs a couple of community shops. So Angie did that community engagement saying, if you kind of look after the cabin and let me know what's happening, then you can get a gift voucher, you can come down to the shop, you can get yourself a new jacket, you can get yourself. And the kids have really taken to that. They kind of see it as their thing. So yeah, I think that, to sum up, just the overall thing about the desire to keep going and the will of the community is not always just enough. You need this will from this cross-sector partnership to desire it to happen, because yeah, putting a cabin on a piece of ground because the community wants it is just the first part. The want for Wheatley South to make it happen because they see the benefit for the residents in terms of their well-being and the turnover, the local authority in terms of seeing that pathway of creativity and how that would impact on young people's choices as they move forward. It's a testament to everybody's work and commitment to do something good. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Graham. And Catherine, Angie, I don't know if you want to come in at this point and say, because I suppose that Graham's answered some of it, because my question was for the community, that sort of 2-year wait. How did you keep people's kind of the community's interest in it as it's going to be theirs in that 2-year period?
Hi everybody. This is actually really nerve-wracking because I can see all your faces and I'm like, oh my God.
They're all friendly.
So just a wee bit of context for me, when we started Lift in 2016, we were putting on small creative willow making and pipe making stuff and creative art type things in our local community centre. We had like 50 people, which was families, it was parents and their kids, attend the wee groups that we were putting together, because like it said in the video, I hated folk slagging off Lochside. I'm Lochside born and bred, and we're actually a really good bunch of folk. So I just wanted to kind of like highlight Lochside and encourage people to come to us. So we started off, like I said, with about 50 folk. There was mums, nanas, kids. And then as time went on, we kind of grew arms and legs. Now, my background is I was just a young mum living in Lochside with my kids. I had no experience whatsoever with business, no experience in running big groups or anything like that. So I had no knowledge like that. So that's where I went to the Stove Network and was like, I need your help. Ken, like, we're growing arms and legs. I didn't ken what road to go on here. And the Stove started mentoring me and supporting me with that. Now, fast forward to 2023, because it was last year, we run events that are that big. We have about 2,000 residents come to our events now. In 2022, we done a big massive bonfire with a big firework display. We had folk come from Ayrshire and everything into Lochside. So for me, that's absolutely massive, because instead of folk trying to run out of Lochside, folk were flocking to Lochside. So I must be doing something right. And when it comes to the cabin, so yes, we were gifted this cabin, and I mean, my attitude was this cabin. It was like a cake. But again, we couldn't have done that without the mentorship for Graham and the support for likes of the Stove, because they've got all that technical and kind of like they've got all that kind of information to get things up and running and stuff. So partnership working is massive. And us ourselves, without any help, had already like formed fantastic partnerships with our local council and with the local housing authority, because they started recognising this group is actually really is making changes in the area that they're living. So it has been a total joint effort. And again, I'd never used the term creative placemaking because it was just something that I was naturally doing. And then it wasn't until I started what we do now, and they were talking about creative placemaking. I was like, I do that. And they're like, yes, you do. This is why you're like really good for this whole what we do now stuff. And I was like, all right, that's good. And then I started learning a bit more about creative placemaking, and I was like, right, how do we keep this cabin alive? Because to me, never ever worked with artists. That's what I was told. I actually really like working with artists because they're really like a clever bunch. And having, so like my view for where I come from, I didn't, there's no much inspiration or anything in Lochside. It's like your Bobby Basic housing estate. So when I met the artist, I was like, oh, we'll paint fences, we'll inject some colour into the neighbourhood. And these artists came in and went, oh no, we can do so much more. And I was like, boom, my head was blown. I was like, right, let's do it. So we got the cabin, and like Graham said, it kind of went to a stalemate, and my head's bursting. I'm thinking, right, how do we keep this alive? And then the artists created their own pop-up tent. So like they carved all the wood, they done all the linen stuff for the tent. So we started directing the tent everywhere and saying to folk, right, come along, this is what the creative outlet thing's got to be like. And then that went to doing portraits of people that were living in the area that I thought wouldn't have had the confidence to actually get their portraits and that done. But they did, and they loved it. And the input that we got for the community, kenning that this cabin was got to be theirs. So like we've got an office space within a building that isn't accessible for everybody. And they folk that were taking part in the cabin, the pop-up tent stuff, wouldn't have access to our building. So they started getting ownership of this cabin, and they wanted this cabin. So thank everybody that is happening this year, because at Easter we went, so we get gifted Easter eggs for Cash for Kids. We work closely with Cash for Kids, and we had all these Easter eggs gifted to us. So we work with the local schools and stuff like that as well. But 100 kids turned up for our Easter event, and each one of them all got their Easter eggs. And this is some kids that wouldn't be able to get an Easter egg, if you get what I mean, because of the social situations that they live in. And these Waynes, they were taking part in clay making, they were doing a big massive Easter hunt. We had grannies and mothers out with the kids. We'd done wee tokens with a wee poem, and you had to figure out where we were. Obviously, we were at the cabin. But they were away hunting all this stuff, and to actually have them all engage with each other, and you could see them shouting across the field, "Here, hen, there's some tokens over here!" And that whole community engagement is massive for us. And that's what Lift's ethos is like, we're there for the community to inject some colour and some happiness, and make sure we try and keep everybody together, rather than it being wee pockets of, what's the word? No cliches, niches, ken, like cliquey folk, ken, like they wee pockets of, you ken what I mean? So I want to bring all that together, and one of the things that we're doing in the community is with the cabin is bringing all that together, different cultures, different races, different everybody, all together. And food, like Catherine said, is massive. In my head, I've got like, I want to have a Lithuanian night, I want to have a Jamaican night, and I want all the ethnicities to come and cook all this food, teach me about your cultures and everything, and teach all your community, and let's all just join together with music and food. I can see a steel band going and fairy lights, and I can't wait. I want jambalaya. I can't wait. So that's what I see this cabin doing. So I do. And again, it is all creative placemaking, because it's bringing everybody together and giving us something that we've never experienced before.
But Andrew, that's absolutely superb. There's comments in there saying how uplifting it is to hear your approach to it, and also that's also interesting. Your reflection on keeping the community engaged with that as you've waited or gone through the process of the 2-year process. From Lift's perspective, I mean, I'm presuming because you're bringing the community together, but you're probably are you then signposting people to other services for people where you're identifying needs within the community as well?
Yep. So like, we work really closely, like I said, with the local schools, and the local schools identify issues or needs, and if we personally can like help people, we signpost them elsewhere to other organisations and other partners that we work with. So what else was I got to say there? Social work, midwives, we work with all them organisations as well, so we do, and quite a lot of them actually come to us for the help. So like, so with the midwives, young mums in the area that have just had kids, they come to us for the shop. So we've got 2 community shops. Everything's £1, so it's available for everybody, affordable for everybody, and it's the local community that actually donate to us. So if somebody comes in with a pram, and then I either get social worker midwives phoning up saying, "Listen, there's a young family, haven't got much money, could you like help them with a cheap pram?" We end up doing it as a referral system where they actually receive all the goods for us for nothing. So in the last 3 years, each year, it's kind of went up nearly like £1,000 every year. We started off giving away £4,000 worth of stuff. Last year, it was during COVID, it was really hectic, as you can imagine. But coming out of COVID, it is about £5,000 worth of items we give away every year free to people in need, and it comes through all different organisations and partnerships through referrals.
Right. Okay, that's good to know. And it's similar to other communities that we've heard from who are doing community-based work, a bit like what we heard from Tuch and Dunfermline 2 months ago. Are there any questions from? Obviously, we've got an audience of people here. Have we got any questions for Catherine, Angie, or Graham? Obviously, Graham's gone through some of the kind of technical challenges that he's faced. But I don't know if anybody else has any questions. You want to put your hand up or pop a question into the chat?
I mean, he's didn't have to, because I actually didn't. I'm actually sitting here with a big beamer.
Can't tell on this. You got a filter on that filters it out. from your perspective, Catherine, looking at the way this has kind of worked for Lochside, are there other sort of projects within Dumfries and Galloway that you think are also similar, that are examples of this approach?
Yeah, I think, like I said, what it actually looks like, there are so many different ways that it could look, and I think still talk about it as creative placemaking. I think for me, what makes something fit within that creative placemaking approach is that it's not just a sort of short, single, isolated project in time, but it's that people like Angie, like, you know, like Graham working with Angie, are working together over long periods of time. So there are lots of different points in that. So right now, the point for Lochside is the cabin. But if we come back and tell this story in 2 years' time, hopefully we're going to have this brand new cultural space, and there's going to be other things around that. It's not just going to be about spaces. They're going to, you know, so it's a long-term, it's an approach to a journey over a period of time. So I think another really interesting example of that right now is what's going on in Stranraer. And again, Graham is very, very involved in this in a sort of project management and delivery and operational way. But what we do now was also working in Stranraer. She was working in 5 places across the region as a pilot. And there's lots going on in Stranraer, lots of levelling up money, and there's redevelopment and consultation around the marina, around the George Hotel, which is on the centre of their high street. And not all of that has initiated from, you know, a creative placemaking, what we would maybe call a community-led place. But these are all the things that are going on. And actually right now, that people are talking to each other, people are working together, and the local authority in Dumfries Galloway has really sort of taken on this, valued the need for this ongoing creative engagement in Stranraer, not only to connect people to what's going on around the marina and George Hotel, but also to build the cultural skills and capacity and activity that is able to move into a new cultural centre, which are their plans for the George Hotel. So we've done a small case study, which we're going to share. But I think, again, coming back and looking at Stranraer in a couple of years is going to be really, really interesting. You know, so there's lots of sort of small starting points for this work.
And that's because, I mean, it's the ongoing nature, because often, for many valid reasons, consultation is a thing that happens, but it is the ongoing continued engagement that is the really important thing.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's our experience, both through the Surfer Awards and through our Alliance for Action, where you have a person that is working with the community all the time, like Angie, but being continually involved, so that you don't have to consult people, because you are working with the people all the time, so you know kind of what people's general needs are. We've got a couple of questions I'm going to take. First one is from Heather McNaughton, so she can't put her hand up. So Heather, if you want, and then I'll come to you, Beth, after we've taken one from Heather.
I just want to say I can put my physical hand up. I just on a Zoom platform that doesn't seem to have a hand today. Anyway, lovely to hear from you, Angela. And everyone else, but I think what really came through from everybody's presentation was the real strength in proper partnership working. Sorry, I'm also looking at my screen sideways. I'll move over. I'm looking at you. Yes, to everybody really play into their strengths, and I think the important part of that is being open to that approach, so everybody seeing that, you know, they can't do it all themselves, and drawing on all of that expertise. And it was just so refreshing to hear, because that's how it should be. So I think that was just an observation. And then I suppose the next thing for me, I used to be a non-executive director on Wheatley Homes South, and I was part of the transition from Dumfries and Galloway Housing Partnership into the new thing, which is Wheatley Homes South. And I'm really interested to know, how are you going along that journey in terms of that master planning and regeneration, and where's the future of the cabin and all of that? Where's your community spaces? How are your voices being heard in that wider regeneration? Because I think, you know, that's always been what would be the most helpful is some investment in there, but being really informed by the community. Sorry, was that a very long-winded question? Yes. So what's the future, and how are you being engaged through this process in the wider regeneration?
Do you want
Graham,
to?
well, Angie's pointing at you, Graham. I think she's pointing at one of us, and I think it's you.
Okay, we'll definitely do a tag team, because Angie's literally involved in it from a steering group point of view and things. But I think, thanks, Heather. It's a really interesting question, really interesting experience if you've come from that transition period as well. It must have been quite an interesting process to be part of. But then the first point, the partnership working is absolutely key. And one point, I guess, I don't know if there's any funders in the room or anybody that's involved in some of the allocation of that. One point I didn't make in my presentation, but it's quite important, is that that 2 year of working is unpaid. Nobody got paid for that. There was no, even when we did the funding application to get the capital, you can't retrospectively claim the hundreds of hours, and not just from ourselves and Angie, Wheatley Homes, Scottish Water, all of that sort of stuff. You know, it's probably a six-figure sum when you wrap all of that sort of stuff up. So that's a wider discussion around the development of projects and partnership time and all of those things. But it also speaks to the commitment around, because some organisations just may not have the support required to actually see some of these potential projects through. And yeah, you know, to sit and go, I'm going to commit, you know, 500 hours unpaid at nights and weekends because I really believe in these people and this project and the partnerships. But not everybody is able to do that. So the finance thing's an interest, and that could probably be a whole presentation on its own. But in terms of like the wider regeneration master plan stuff that's going on in Lochside, it's a fascinating time in general for Lochside. And you could go very political around some of the discussions around master planning processes and things, but I think I can speak with Angie. I think we just treat that process as being transparent, and any opportunity that LIFT has had to not only interact with master plan consultations or development plans, but also from Wheatley Home South point of view, to physically bring the community to some of these engagement events. That was one of the triggers for the cabin. Wheatley Home South said, we want to support it, but we need people in the room to actually instigate the trigger. So we got, was it 32 people on the 9th of December to come to an event. And that was the thing. Wheatleys were then like, whoa, okay, this has got some serious community voice behind it. 32 doesn't sound a lot, but on the context of maybe 2 or 3 people turning up to the previous ones, you know. And then, so there's the housing association sort of agenda, if you like, and strategy that links into master planning and local authorities. But then there's also the local authority that have a role to play within that conversation. And we are in discussions with economic development around LIFT's HQ, because the thing that is coming out constantly, whether it's through the master planning process, whether it's through discussions with Wheatleys, or whether it's through discussions with communities, that there needs to be a permanent thing in Lochside that is around creative placemaking. So the Dumfries and Galloway Council Economic Development are very interested in perhaps pipelining that type of facility within their larger capital projects longer term. Could be 5 years, it could be 10 years. And then there's influence around that process on both sides. So if there's master planning conversations going on, then the HQ is sort of in there. And then I'm going to pass you over to Angie, because Angie's practically involved in that in terms of like steering group stuff as well.
Yeah. So LIFT actually sit on the Lochside Regen committee group. So we do get to have an input into what is going to be happening within Lochside and working with Wheatley and the other local authorities that are involved with it. And by the way, I actually liked when no offence to anybody from Wheatley here, but I actually did like DGHP when they had the community officer. They didn't have that anymore. It was Gordon Williamson. He was actually the best. Just putting it right out there.
And can I add a little bit as well in terms of, you know, when we've talked about the multiple layers, and I don't mean to go this way, they're sort of across the way, but sometimes they do feel hierarchical. You know, our director, our CEO, Matt Baker, and I think the rest of us as well, and, you know, we all put ourselves in spaces that take a lot of capacity and energy to put ourselves into those spaces at a regional level. So there's a place planning partnership that Dumfries and Galloway Council have set up, which is really good because it brings the place team, it brings people from economic development, it brings people from the Borderlands inclusive growth, it brings people together into a space that are not normally around a table together, that's talking about challenges that are arising in particular places, but how they might be arising in similar places across the region. Now, I really hope that that continues, because I think what happens is sometimes these spaces are set up and then things change and we move. But for me, it doesn't really matter what it's called, but we need to be in those conversations around the table to talk about this type of work. I think often the community voice, the community engagement, it is relying on that filtering up through local authority or other systems, whereas actually I think organizations like LIFT, like Angie coming into this space today, the Stove being at the Place Planning Partnership, we've got a advisory group for the What We Do Now network for Dumfries and Galloway. People need to be working together in those spaces for strategies, and that's how I think the barriers can really start to go, okay, well, wait a minute, this has happened in a number of places. This, somebody said about planning permissions, you know, how can that be addressed actually?
Thanks. Thanks very much. That's a really comprehensive answer from all of you, and interesting to hear. And I think Lauren had a question actually, which you've answered, Graham, around the role of local authorities in it. Beth, I said I'd come back to you because you had your hand up for a question.
Yeah, thank you. And you've kind of really touched on it. I work supporting local place plans over in the Scottish Borders, so I'm super inspired to hear all of you talking, and you know, it's certainly going to take a lot of learning back across the borders. I'd be interested to hear a bit more. I know you're talking about it being an iterative process where you're working on planning and community-led delivery at the same time, but to hear a bit more about how you might be involved in a local place plan for your area, and what effects you see that happening in terms of making planning permissions easier further down the line potentially, and also for creating a pipeline of projects for investment.
Angie, I can talk about that from a sort of broader but not specific to Lochside. Do you want to start with how you've been involved with the place planning process in Lochside, and then I can come in and then, I mean, Graham can also talk to that in terms of how the activity that we've been doing in Stranraer is sort of running alongside the place plan in Stranraer.
To be honest, I was listening to what she was asking there, and I didn't really understand the question, and he just went.
I'm just wondering whether you're involved in developing a local place plan, Angie, for your area.
Is that one completely hang?
No, so there is a place plan in that you have been involved in, like, I think some of the consultations and the work that's been happening has been gone into the place planning process in Lochside, yes. But it actually hasn't been that joined up to what you've been involved in, is yes, from my perspective.
Aye, they're not actually calling it a place plan for Lochside. It's something different that they call it now.
Well, there's two things. There's a Lochside master plan, and then there is a Lochside place plan as well. And I think that that's a good example of how there could be a better connection, I think, between the sort of place plan and I don't think that's for lack of will and people wanting to do the same thing. It's actually a capacity issue, you know, and I think, you know, as you'll be aware, that there's a lot of support for, or there's a bit of support, and there's some support for initial place plans and money, but there isn't actually that support for the revenue and for the actual work to make that happen. So there's a real issue there around the pipeline, which is specifically about revenue, and about what you do with like the, you know, in Dumfries and Galloway we've got 500, $1,000, and then, you know, a couple of grand, but then it's like, how is that then connected to this on the ground sort of real activity that through creative community engagement? I think that the place plan, what we've seen, is a real mechanism for sort of community empowerment. So we're working with quite a lot of development trusts across Dumfries and Galloway, and are connected with them through the What We Do Now network and our work, who see that as a real way for this visioning, you know, a tool, a mechanism for starting and initiating this visioning. But there's still a lot of work to be done on making sure that that doesn't just stagnate, a little bit like the porta cabin. You know, and for the best will in the world, it will, unless there's the resources and that's put in place. In Stranraer, the place plan, because of the Borderlands Inclusive Growth deal, there was, you know, and Stranraer being one of the places for investment, there was a lot more being able to put into their place plan. And I think that has been a really valuable mechanism. And the work that we've been doing around the creative engagement has certainly connected with that. And, you know, the people that have been leading that work have been coming to vision and action meetings at Creative Stranraer, which is an organisation that the Stove is supporting, to has just constituted in its own right. You know, there's a whole load going on. So I think it's definitely an important part of the piece. But I think the ongoing collaboration and how it works is something we need to continue to learn and evolve together.
That's really interesting, Catherine, because I would agree that, I mean, over the years, local place plans, previously charrettes, without finance for delivery of what results in that plan, it can feel then a frustrating waste of time that you've invested in it if something hasn't arisen from it. But I think also, actually, Angie's, your response there was interesting as well, because, you know, do communities care what it's called? I mean, is it a local place plan? Is that I mean, the only people that care about those are people who have to in paid roles, or people that think it's maybe a mechanism to achieve something by. But actually, for a lot of communities, they want to share information about what the community needs are. How that gets used, it's important that people who are in decision-making roles and delivery roles, that they then use it for the right purposes in creating delivery. But I find it a really interesting, the local place plan is obviously the newest kind of thing on the block, and there's a lot of focus on that. But I know that there's information already there that can, for a lot of communities, that could populate a local place plan really easily without having to do a separate series of events. And the community fundamentally doesn't care. It wants stuff to happen, and it wants its place improved, and whatever the name du jour is not the important. I'm going to take one final question because we're running well over time, because everyone's obviously interested in what you've got to say. But Tracy, and there's also some really good chat, because obviously it's been pointed out that this is a really good shared learning opportunity. And thanks, David Somerville, for putting the link to Scottish Community Alliance Learning Exchange in the chat. But Tracy, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Ewan. Just to introduce myself, I'm Tracy Hughes from Wheatley Housing Group, and I'm a regeneration coordinator. I've joined the company about just a year and a half ago, so I have to kind of give most of the kudos to my colleague Nadine in Wheatley Home South, who had really been instrumental in getting the master plan off the ground. The chat has been really, really interesting, and it's been great to actually put a face to the name, Angela. So I've heard a lot about you guys. I thought I'd just jump in very quickly and give a bit of background in terms of Wheatley Home's approach to regeneration, and it's fundamentally taking a replication from what we're doing in Glasgow with Transforming Communities Glasgow, and the setup of working in real partnership with the council, but also the importance of having the community on board. And thankfully, Wheatley really see that as such a solid foundation for any kind of regeneration project. You work from the grassroots up. And the whole theme of partnership working, you know, we all know is tried and tested, and if it works well, it's brilliant. just to add a bit on about Lochside in itself having various different kind of plans, the idea that the master plan will eventually become part of the LDP. So you then have a kind of really concrete structure that will inform the direction of development within that area. And thereafter, Wheatley will work with our housing officers and continue engagement with the people that live in Lochside, because we're now rolling out our own local place plans, for want of a better word, but that Wheatley use and able to pull together our connections with local authorities and other groups to make sure that the places themselves continue to thrive. And if there's any kind of social issues, or not just housing related issues, it's real community grassroots, working with police, etc., that if Wheatley, with their powers and know-how, can help just create and maintain those communities ongoing. It's a kind of new initiative that our housing colleagues are running out. Anyway, to get to my question, as I mentioned, Transforming Communities Glasgow, we're working in a lot of really deprived areas where there isn't the kind of conduit that SoSE have, and when we hand off to local delivery groups, or try to form community councils, I'd be interested to understand a bit more in terms of the empowerment and where there are areas where we don't have already established really great kind of groups that understand development. Like the Graham's input into everything sounds that it has been really invaluable. What would be your kind of key pointers in terms of how we initiate that community empowerment, so that when Wheatley move away and the development's built, there's a group there that can really know where to go to for help?
Shall I come in on that? I think it's a really good point, and people have asked us that quite a lot. I think I would sort of start by saying that there is always actually something in a place that's sort of going on. It's just that it might not have the platform or the confidence or the support that it requires. And I think, again, maybe to use Stranraer, it's a little bit different, but as a sort of example, we would say that creative engagement is absolutely a foundational approach, because it brings people into what would be a traditional consultation process that wouldn't normally come into that space if it's given the time and the commitment, because it can consult, if you like, in a way that's really in depth, and in ways that I suppose people sort of ease into a consultation, rather than going, I've had that before, and nobody, that's not for me, or whatever. And I think initially sometimes it's about it might be somebody going into a place or working with somebody who really understands that process, and in community enterprise we work with other partners who what's going on, how can you sort of find what's going on, and then often, like, is there just a sort of a thing that you can start working together on that I think sometimes is separate from the big issue, whether it's housing or a place plan or local development. So in Stranraer, there was the opportunity where it was this community garden, and the SoSE had been approached as part of a national program, the Dandelion project, to deliver a garden, and we felt that working through one of our Stranraer partners was a really good idea. So this unexpected garden sort of brought the community together, started to be able to appoint somebody to start working in that place, and it started to bring multiple partners together who hadn't been working together before. So the person who was working with the garden was employed with Stranraer Development Trust, but the SoSE was sort of giving a bit of mentoring support because we had that expertise, but we're not on the ground in Stranraer. Other people started to come together, and because it was maybe something that was a little bit sideways, it wasn't directly about the marina or the redevelopment or the master plan or anything. However, people were sort of working together, so it suddenly became a space to start to talk about those things. And what it highlighted was the need that there wasn't someone to continue that creative engagement in Stranraer. So the Stove has been supporting the constitution of a new organisation, Creative Stranraer, to continue that creative engagement. So I think that's a long-winded way of saying that even if there's no groups, there's probably individuals in a place, in a community, who feel like Angie about their community and really just don't know where to start.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, we've got various methodologies where you can sort of bring those people together and start to create a bit of a collective of how they can be empowered. But there will need to be ongoing sort of buddying and mentorship and capacity support.
Yeah, it's the ongoing capacity support that's the kind of, I think we need to figure out where that would come from. Bearing in mind councils are very stretched, but you know, there are groups that maybe would have that. You just have to dig a bit deeper and see where it sits.
And I think that's where you can bring somebody in. You know, initially it's like the Stove is working in Stranraer, but with the view of pulling out. Graham, you might want to come in on that.
Yeah, I think as well, one of the most fascinating challenges around that connect point, whether it's the anchor organisation, whether it's an individual, the difference, so the challenge is also the opportunity, the difference between the sort of dynamic nature of a small group of willing people versus a system, whichever way you cut it, there is a system. And when you know, and a system may be like, you can't change the color of your wall in a flat, because if you change the color of the wall in that flat, that becomes a framework that then every single flat that housing association owns could be changed to that color. That creates a risk. A larger organisation is more risk averse, so they retreat back into their system and retreat back to the no. And that's just like one example. And like, we've come up against that as part of our process multiple times in terms of that. So it's the opportunity all the time. It's about the opportunity to prove ourselves and prove our methodologies and prove our style of communication into a system where it adds value on the system side. And then once you've added value into a system, then that can be replicated and it can be understood much more easier. The challenge is always about getting to the person in the system who can just like bend it a wee bit to prove that it works, because otherwise the system's closed and the system's perception of what's needed to be inputted is not actually the grassroots community-led thing. It's the perception of the grassroots community-led thing. And they're kind of two different bits. So the more bridges that are made and the more sort of commitment to learning of bringing people or process in from either side can only be a good thing. So yeah, more people that can get around the table to instigate action is really good.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Graham.
I know you want to move. Oh yeah, sorry. Can I just say one second?
More thing, Catherine.
You know, I was just going to say, just to advocate for the role that certain creative practitioners can bring. You know, like if you look up Jana van Heesvik, just look her up. Look at the way that the Home Baked started in Liverpool. You know, that was actually one person, a creative, going into a space and doing something quite exciting. And I do think certain creative practitioners have the potential to spark something in a community. So
thanks very much, Catherine, and we would support that as well from a perspective. So we're 20 minutes over time, but the conversation has been totally fascinating, and it's been very rich from what we've heard from all of you. So thank you very much, Catherine, Angie, and Graham. But obviously stay on. We're going to have a break come back at 11:30. So if you're holding on for the loo, I'm sorry that we've gone over time. And then we'll hear from Rob, bringing community wealth building into this discussion. And then maybe this discussion will open up again and there might be more questions for you at the end. So thank you very much. But I really appreciate what you've shared with us. See you all in 10 minutes.
Thanks, everyone.
Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for continuing to join with us this morning, and thanks for the messages of appreciation for the presentations that we've heard from our speakers this morning. And it's been interesting hearing from a hyper-local perspective as to kind of how this kind of works. And now we are going to hear maybe from a more strategic perspective on creative placemaking and community wealth building. And so I would like to invite Rob from Cycle Scotland Enterprise, Rob Davidson, to join us now. And Rob, over to you. What's SoSE's perspective on this?
Ewan, thank you very much indeed. I kind of feel bad about following on from Angela's brilliant description of what's been happening in Lift, because I kind of want to hear more about that, but I'll do my best to make the strategic perspective at least a wee bit interesting and engaging, I hope. And I suppose the title you offered me, Building Community Wealth Building into the Fabric of Creative Placemaking, prompts an immediate question, which I guess is why should we? Because after all, everyone's still getting to grips with community wealth building, and we're still in a pilot phase with that across Scotland. And it's equally fair to say, I think, that not everybody who's engaged in economic development will necessarily be entirely familiar or comfortable with creative placemaking. So, I mean, are we just making some complicated things even more complicated and actually, you know, layering on more things on top of all the layers and all the organizations that folk who would just like to make the places they live in better have to engage with and work their way through? I don't think so. And of course, to an extent, I suppose I would say that, but I don't think so. And here's why. I think that there are really strong links and I guess mutual strengths that are common to creative placemaking and community wealth building. They both have a real emphasis on imagination and innovation. They are both very community focused and ideally community led. I think they're mutually complementary in their interest in place, and both highlight plural ownership of the economy as a key objective. I'm wondering whether Catherine might be able to share her screen and the really helpful last slide that you've got, Catherine.
Yeah, I'll do that now.
Thanks very much. If we could make that bigger so everyone can see it.
Is that good?
Brilliant. Thanks, Catherine. Really grateful. So this is included in what we do now is brilliant creative placemaking approach. Catherine shared the link in the chat and I'd really urge anyone who hasn't had a chance to read it to have a look at it. And it came about from a conversation that I had initially with Matt Baker while SoSE, what we do now, we're developing their creative placemaking approach, which SoSE and a couple of my colleagues had supported. And when Matt showed me the original version of this, which looked a little bit different, I immediately said, oh, this is community wealth building. Of course, I immediately, looking back in that, felt a little bit embarrassed because it's a little bit presumptuous, given that's trying to attach somebody else's term to our already well-developed area of practice. But I didn't mean it in any sense to try and co-opt it into community wealth building. I was incredibly excited that what I saw were the potential links between the two areas of practice. And so we had a look at the interrelationships between the pillars of community wealth building, and you see 4 of them around the outside in circles and the 5th is in the middle. And it didn't really feel to us as though any of this was having to be kind of shoehorned into place in any kind of artificial manner. It all just seemed to fit. But of course, I guess you can do that with any diagram, and it's, you know, it's easy enough to do that on paper. But it was really informed by our mutual experiences of what happened with creative placemaking and economic development in Dumfries and Galloway over years, and in fact decades now, because we've got these case studies and lived experience, which Catherine and Graham and Angela outlined in terms of Lochside and Stranraer. We've got Mid-Steeple Quarter, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with slightly older examples that are highlighted in the creative placemaking approach in Cat Strands, a community-owned art centre in the Glen Kens in Dumfries and Galloway, which is still a community-owned art centre, but also active in a really broad range of social and economic development above and beyond the provision of the facility and the programme of events that it does on an annual basis. So it felt like the alignment on the plan actually reflected what we knew to be true on the ground, that in fact these two things are potentially very closely interlinked, and can provide and create really powerful and effective improvement and development of the places that they're located in. Maybe just take that slide down now. Thanks very much, Catherine. Compel everyone to look at my face for radio. But they're all examples, in my view, where creative placemaking has led or is leading to community wealth building in practice. But of course, what happens in practice can't be predetermined by the strategy. And actually, that's what's really so interesting about community wealth building and creative placemaking. It's the thing they have in common. You can't go into either being certain that you know what the outcome is going to be. It has to be driven by what you find and what people tell you they want. So if there is wider interest, and I sincerely hope there is wider interest in the relationship between creative placemaking, community wealth building, economic development, I want to make 3 suggestions as to how I think we can maybe start to take this forward. And I hope they're very much founded in and respectful of the creative placemaking approach that what we do now have developed. And the 3 things are parity of esteem, thinking flexibly, and collaborating well. I guess parity of esteem is critical because creative placemaking is creative placemaking. I know the very first thing that I said when I was introduced to it was, this is community wealth building, but actually creative placemaking is its own thing, and it's valuable in and of itself. It's not subordinate to community wealth building or to economic development. So it's not just a means of doing a different style or better quality of community engagement. It has to be more, and is more than that. It's more fundamental than that. But they are mutually complementary. They'll sometimes work independently, but I think that they will very commonly be much stronger where they are able to work together. I think, and we've seen demonstrated today, that there are and will be situations where creative placemaking, community wealth building will absolutely need and will benefit from each other. After all, I think when I was speaking at EDAS just recently, I mentioned the fact that Mid-Steeple Quarter arose out of, as Catherine said earlier on, a very lengthy, sustained, in-depth process of creative placemaking that led to that brilliant idea that's become, a real landmark and a trailblazing project. I think perhaps to some extent, before what we do now launched, the creative placemaking approach, because not least it's just been a while since it happened, the fact that it started from a creative placemaking, a creative arts approach, I'd maybe just got a little bit lost in the midst of time. And I think it's really important that we bring that back to the front and we recognise and appreciate how important that was, and the fact that it led to an entirely different approach to what we might do with a problem town centre. So I think that they may operate independently, but I believe they can be much stronger together. And parity of esteem between creative placemaking and community wealth building is absolutely fundamental. Thinking flexibly, well, what I think we see is that creative placemaking produces potentially a very slow burn, takes an awful lot of time, an awful lot of effort, and it will undoubtedly be challenging too. Mid-Steeple Quarter certainly was, but it was undoubtedly worth pursuing. I think Catherine made a really important point about creative placemaking and indeed community wealth building not having a fixed end point, because I don't think it is necessarily project specific. Both will lead to individual projects, but they're much more about how you do what you do over a length of time, over a long period of time potentially, than they are about delivering individual projects. But fundamentally, why I think that both are important is that community wealth building invites us to imagine different ways of developing a local and a regional economy. And so it strikes me as being really important that everyone with an interest in community wealth building ought to be alongside the practitioners for whom imagination is their business. And that's where I think there's a critical, really vital link between the two disciplines. And the third point being collaborating well, and I do think this is such an important point of emphasis throughout the creative placemaking approach, the diagrams, the text, literally everything is really focusing on the criticality of collaborating well. All of this works well when we collaborate well. I think there's no doubt about that. I think it's absolutely inherent in, as I say, in the creative placemaking approach. And, you know, okay, at face value, that's a no-brainer. And it is, but we still need to do it. And the doing of it, I think, is more difficult and more complex than the agreement that it's what we all ought to be doing. You know, I would urge everyone that's working on community wealth building to, you know, keep some thinking space for the folk that are working on creative placemaking and vice versa. Be aware of what each other are doing. Try and find the links, because they're almost certainly there. If they're not, then that's absolutely fine, because both should be responding to what communities are saying they actually want. But the lived experience in Dumfries and Galloway suggests that actually there probably are stacks of links, and they will grow and strengthen and become innovative and interesting as they develop. I think one of the great strengths of both of these approaches, whether they're working separately or in tandem, is how many people and organisations and agencies can be mobilised around the aspirations and the ambitions of a community. I think if we get to the point where it's almost indistinguishable who's doing what, but it's governed by what the community is saying it needs and the evidence that the community can provide of what it needs and why it needs it, that I think in due course might become quite a good marker of success. One of the things that attracted me to community wealth building in the first place is the fact that we're still developing it. It's still a work in progress. And, you know, I don't believe anywhere, either nationally, internationally, or locally, any one finished version of community wealth building. In fact, I'm not necessarily sure that you ever finish it in a traditional sense. And it struck me as so interesting that that was a critical point around creative placemaking, that, you know, it's not a single exercise in developing one thing or doing one engagement process. It's an ongoing way of doing what you do in order to continually improve your community for the benefit of the people that live in it. So I think for all of those reasons, developing creative placemaking and community wealth building together makes sense. And I think that both can and will be enriched by that. And I mean, one of the things I really like about the What We Do Now partnership is the frank question that it poses in its title. I mean, I think that's fundamental to all of us that are interested in any sort of economic, social, community development. What do we do now? I think that one of the things that we can do now is to develop and work up in practical terms on the ground that partnership between creative placemaking and community wealth building, always on the proviso that it's desired and needed. And I think that will help us to develop the next series of really brilliant questions, really brilliant answers, I should say, to that fundamental, critically important question. So, Ewan, really happy to just leave it there and take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Rob. That was really helpful, because one of the things that I was interested about what's developed in the document. So I think when I saw it sort of 18 months ago, community wealth building wasn't part of it, and actually community wealth building itself was at a much earlier stage in a kind of policy concept. And so when it was produced this April, or just April there, it was really good to see it as part of that, because I can see the links between the two. I suppose one of my initial sort of thoughts or questions, and maybe for you and for Catherine, because a lot of community wealth building discussion and focuses around procurement. And I suppose one of the questions is, how do we ensure that, because I think one of the two things that you and Catherine both mentioned as well that I find helpful, and actually all speakers have mentioned this, it's messy. Creativity is creative placemaking and community work is messy. And that isn't a bad thing. I think the alternative phrase we can use is it's rich, because it's a complicated thing, but it's also a slow burn. So it requires investment for a long time. And what's been helpful from hearing from you, Rob, from an economic development perspective is, yes, it is a slow burn, but it's a long-term investment and it pays off. So, and I think that kind of came out in some of the questions that were being asked earlier. But going back to sort of the procurement question, how do we sort of ensure that creativity is sort of part of procurement processes? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Okay, so that one caught me completely unawares. That is undoubtedly still a work in progress, although I would congratulate colleagues in Dumfries and Galloway Council who are procuring a creative placemaking framework right now, which I think is a really interesting and potentially a really good move. Of course, my perspective on that isn't as someone who'd be writing the tender documents, so absolutely respect that Catherine might have a different view, but I do think that there's something quite important in that. Resource is incredibly tight right across the piece, but this sort of really productive work won't be done on the cheap. Mid-Steeple Quarter, has required a great deal of resource, and I know we shouldn't be simply talking about Mid-Steeple Quarter, but let's stick with that for a minute. Has required a great deal of resource in order to do something that's potentially really transformational and really important, and it's had to come from a whole wide variety of places. One of the things that I think we need to look carefully at, and I hope this is where my colleagues in D&G Council are going with this, is the resource for that initial work. Because resourcing the project is not as difficult as resourcing the initial creative placemaking work, because you don't know where it's going to go. And therefore, the standard way of assessing an application would be, well, what do you intend to get out of it? The honest answer has to be, we don't know yet, because we're still going to go and ask. And so that, I think, still needs to be worked through a bit. Although I'm quite encouraged, as I say, that council colleagues are feel like they're getting into a more comfortable place with that. I would also freely admit that this, ought not properly to be just a matter for local authorities. I think economic development agencies have a role in it too. So we supported to an extent the development of the creative placemaking approach. There will, I am sure, be an ongoing role for us in what we can contribute and how we can support this sort of work, potentially, perhaps at its very early kind of stages of inception. I was going to say, just on the point about messiness, I think messiness is good, because the alternative is probably the system design town centres that tended not to do very well when they were introduced in the immediate post-war period, and they looked wonderful in the drawings and were never really very human when they were actually delivered. So I tend towards the idea that the kind of messy is probably a bit more reflective of what we actually want as human beings, and I think there's something about trying to just make sure that doesn't get stamped on. You can over strategize. And I'm always very mindful of that myself. You can definitely over strategize. You've got to make sure that the messy is still there and still important, because otherwise I suspect there's a risk that we start not there's a risk that we don't get the good outcomes that we might otherwise get if we just celebrated it a bit and accepted it's what we're going to work with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Rob. Sorry, it was a left field question, but you answered it well from a SoSE perspective. Catherine, do you have any comment on the sort of procurement and creativity? Because I'm aware of it being a sort of Dumfries and Galloway Council product, possibly. I don't know if you can tell us anything more about it.
Yeah, it was really interesting going through that process recently. The deadline was the 22nd of May, and we had we're quite new to Public Contract Scotland and the procurement policies that local and national government need to go through. We have done it a little bit before, and I think in principle, absolutely, agree with Rob. It's really great that Dumfries and Galloway Council are seeing that they need to have a framework like that in order to procure this type of work from local, and there was a local weighting of organizations like us that can do that type of work. I mean, at the same time, I think it's this work has deep and long-term impact when you look at the very, very micro and the macro. So you look at the local, and you look at the systems that are around that. And the framework would have been virtually impossible for, say, Lift or anybody else to put themselves forward for. It was a real struggle even for the Stove. We had a lot of support from community enterprise, which was brilliant, and people who have gone through this process. We don't have a team that's really good at doing Public Contract Scotland tenders. But my ambition is that, that if we get through the door with this, that through subcontracting and through the What We Do Now network, that we can therefore bring other people who don't necessarily have the capacity to get on it themselves through and sort of be a funnel. But within that, we therefore have to have a sort of federated type sort of operating and management structure that we need to look at, you know, even within the SoSE and the What We Do Now network. And I think that comes back to this bigger finance question of there are some really interesting things happening at regional, you know, local government level, like through shared prosperity funds and, you know, what Cora are doing, you know, with sort of a more bigger agencies sort of approach. But I think there's still a big piece of work around the resourcing and the financing and the shared resources of firstly getting those resources in place, but then also making sure that the right people can access them. And I think there's a real opportunity though, for sort of you know, collectives to come together and go forward for sort of pieces of work. And I suppose that's why we're sort of passionate about networks, or, you know, some of this work you really just can't do it on your own. So, and it was interesting talking. Rob and I had a meeting with Naomi Mason of CLES, and I said, from a community wealth building perspective, what's the hardest piece? And both Rob and Naomi were saying it's the financing, it's thinking differently about financing. And I thought that was really, really interesting.
So that's really interesting, Catherine, because I would agree that because public procurement is often seen as large scale things. And so I think not just in the creative sector, but in all sorts of sectors where things are operating at a smaller scale, then being geared up. And we know from the examples in Ayrshire where individual traders have been given support to do it. But I think that sort of federation kind of approach is also quite an interesting way of looking at it. Rob, we had a question from Lauren McNeil, who's asking, she's really interested to hear your views on the role of local development plans and land use planning in delivering community wealth building.
I think potentially very powerful indeed. And I must apologise, I'm going back to Mid-Steeple Quarter as an example, but the fact that Mid-Steeple Quarter was included in LDP 2, I think it would have been at the time, and there was quite a clear explanation of what the intention of that was in planning terms and the sorts of things that were likely to be supported through LDP 2 for Mid-Steeple Quarter. I suspect did it no harm at all in terms of the project making progress and being delivered. It is a great shame that at the same time there's a really interesting opportunity which hasn't developed to anywhere near the same extent in Dumfries, not in the town centre but very close to it, in Rosefield Mills, which is another project that SoSE are working on with the Dumfries Historic Buildings Trust in this instance. But it was at such a much earlier stage that there wasn't really any opportunity to include much more than a sentence saying, you know, this might be something that we'll look at in terms of repurposing. And because varying local development plans, certainly at that point, was much more rigidly controlled, that kind of preserved one and asked the other to go forward and develop. So I do think there's something really important in there about having a think as LDPs are being developed about the ways in which they can take a permissive approach to community wealth building, particularly around the land and assets pillar, where I genuinely think they could help to unlock a great deal of potential. And it's just, you know, that there is that quite interesting contrast between the one that really got in and got featured and the one that wasn't ready yet, and where they've been able to get to in the intervening period.
I suppose from both your perspectives, I suppose that I'm aware of Rosefield as well, in terms of community capacity to manage more than one large scale project, because the Mid-Steeple is, and I mean, the Mid-Steeple always frustrates me because it's like everyone points to the Mid-Steeple as the great example. It's like, we need more examples so that we don't keep having to go back to the Mid-Steeple. But it's really hard not to go back to the Mid-Steeple because it is a very particular, unique and high profile and good project. And by coincidence, my colleague in Gervin has just emailed me during this meeting to say she's about to take a group down to Mid-Steeple. She's not in the meeting today, this meeting, because there's a possibility with Gervin taking on some ownership of some building. But yeah, so but in terms of community capacity, are there limits to how much a community can deal with in large scale kind of projects? I don't know if either you have any reflections on that, because it's one of the things we are interested in at SURF around community capacity to deliver things or be engaged in things, and that there are possibly limits, and we're aware that there are many disposals happening across local authorities, and can communities take them all on, and that kind of question. And I don't know if you have any reflections on what that's meant in Dumfries.
Shall I come in first?
Yeah.
And Graham might have something to say on this. I think there absolutely, I mean, there are limits in terms of people's mental health and sort of burnout. But I suppose what you also were referring to are limits in terms of skills and expertise. And I think in this work, what we're really trying to platform and advocate for, which Angie really brought up in her initial story of talking about Lift, is that there are skills and expertise that, even though we talk about grassroots led, we talk about community led, when it really comes to practice, we actually aren't valuing those skills and expertise quite as the way that we need to. And we need to, you know, and people doing brilliant work and the intention is there, but it's like, but then there needs to be more understanding of how those, the local skills and expertise and knowledge is really nurtured and supported. And then, yes, you can then identify that there might be, you know, skills and expertise really required in place planning, for example, or in business, doing a business plan, or looking at the economics of something, or fundraising, or, you know, lots of different things, or people management. And I think that's where it's not that it all needs to be in a place already or locally, but it's when something is brought in, how is it connecting with what's already there? And how is the opportunity for upskilling and developing those skills and capacity in that place really brought to the fore? You know, whether that's through mentorship or buddying, or, you know, so for example, when Graham said about that fundraising application to Creative Scotland, the Stove did a huge amount of work support of that application. There were policies that Lift did not have, so they wouldn't have been eligible for Creative Scotland. So they sort of borrowed, and in that application, it was like, you know, Lift has some of these policies, but in order to move into the next phase where they would have all these policies themselves, like fair work, freelancers policy, that part of the application is to work with Lift to develop their own policies. You know, during that fundraising application, we didn't have the capacity within the Stove, so we actually brought in an associate to support. But there was one of Angie's employees, new employees, young person, shadowed that person and really worked with that sort of funding application process. So, I mean, that again is back to that community wealth building model, is, you know, how are those skills being nurtured and grown in a place? And, you know, again, like, you know, not being scared to bring in skills, but where does the power lie in whether or not that external expertise that's being brought in is really being accountable to the community, or accountable to a system which really has the ambitions and the drive, but because of the nature of a bigger system, because they don't have those day-to-day relationships, they will miss, you know, like Graham said about those perspectives, they will miss the real need. So there has to be that that ongoing reflection process to catch those things when they're missed or when they're not working.
Helpful answer. And I would say that, and that's one of the challenges I think we can see in communities, where that power balance between sort of incoming consultants who have technical expertise, how they work with communities, and making sure that the community remains the empowered part of that kind of decision-making process. And Rob, I don't know if you have any thoughts on sort of the capacity when SoSE are looking across communities, the sort of capacity within communities, and how SoSE has a role to play within that.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a huge issue. There's no doubt about it. And just because we have very well organized communities that have achieved a great deal already doesn't mean that even they have, you know, a ladle full of extra capacity to take on the next exciting thing that we might be thinking they'd be interested in. Because actually, what the response we very commonly get now is, hands are full, right? We're pretty much there, you know. We might have a think about it, but in all honesty, what you bring to the table to help. So, certainly our communities team do a great deal of that sort of individual, really quite long-term detailed work to help with whatever the proposal or the idea is, and capacity and skills is almost invariably a significant portion of that. And it does in no small part also play into our demographic challenges, the fact that we benefited massively from a whole retirement of the folk my parents' age, basically, that managed to come down here in their 50s and 60s and went, great, we've got loads of transferable skills and knowledge, we'll just help get stuff done. And they're all now quite legitimately saying, actually, it's time for real retirement. There isn't the succession to come through in many instances, certainly, because younger folk are seeking their fortunes elsewhere. So, on an individual community by community or project by project level, it's a significant issue, but it's directly related to the really big, chunky challenges that the organisation was set up to try and start addressing. I always follow that by immediately reminding folk we've only been around 4 years, so some of this is going to take a bit of time to address. But yeah, this is an absolutely fundamental challenge, and it's probably the biggest single one for us, in all honesty. I mean, finance is always tricky, and getting the right collaborations, the right alignment of things, of course, that all takes time and effort. But the fundamental issue of capacity is I think, probably the single biggest challenge, and one of the biggest, without doubt, so far as community wealth building is concerned. I think there's no question about that.
That's well, Graham, do you have is that you, Graham?
It won't be long because it's such a fascinating conversation. I think to add an extra piece into the capacity challenge, it's quite an interesting way to look at it, is that with each additional layer of capacity that is required or delivered, there then puts this other pressure on capacity in terms of finance and funding. And we would never talk about it in terms of competition, but it's where this balance around this larger conversation about how the sort of not systemic reform, but that approach to multi-year support around capacity and community wealth building, because it's great to get a project off the ground and you can do the free development, you can get it going, but then all of a sudden that new thing is then into the pot that all of the other things are in, without the pot getting any bigger every year necessarily. If anything, it gets smaller. So, but at the same time, that project is through community aspirations, so there's an expectation there. So that wider approach to how creative placemaking and community wealth building is valued in an economic sense, in order to then put the capacity in at finance level, in order to then ensure that the capacity and people and projects all sort of starts to feed through. It's all of that capacity thing is all interlinked, because the tap is not flowing as fully as we would all like it. That's the reality of it. So how do you ensure that everybody has the right to have that thing happen, at the same time as everybody else being able to survive in the same sort of systems? It's fascinating.
It is. I mean, it's one of the, I suppose, within the community empowerment agenda, which SURF would agree is a really important agenda. But it doesn't happen for free. It will only happen with, and we have interesting policy and legislation, and yes, it's not perfect, but actually it's the resourcing of it that is the kind of thing that we would say is the significant part of it to make things happen. And it's that long-term commitment, the slow burn. You will not see the benefit, you will not see the major benefits of it for some time. You will get benefits in the short term, but the bigger benefits are going to be a sort of a longer time coming. We've had positive responses in the chat. I don't know if anyone else has any other questions for any of our speakers on any of the topics that we've kind of covered this morning. We had a wee bit of a drop off at midday. I think there might have been another event that was maybe starting at midday. It was a very precise 2 minutes to 12 that some people went. I've not got any more questions from the audience. Is there any sort of final things that any of you would like to share with us from your perspective? And I mean, one of the things I would reflect on is the diagram that you started with shows kind of the complexity of it, Catherine, was really sort of helpful. And you can see that there are other elements of placemaking that people could use, because I know you're not saying creative placemaking is the only way of doing things, but it was actually a very helpful diagram for people to probably think about how other things could be used, or just things that people should be thinking about when they approach placemaking and working with communities. So I think it's one of the things I like about the document. I think people can probably see themselves in it, even if they're not coming from a specifically creative approach. I think that's something that people can probably lift things from as an approach to working across broader communities. But I don't know if any of you have sort of final things that you kind of want to share with us before we maybe wrap the meeting up.
Well, I think I just looking through the comments, and I think yeah, Beth was saying about third sector interfaces, and I think that maybe speaks to what you're saying there, Ewan, that I think there's a map in the document of the south of Scotland where we've sort of highlighted a lot of, not all of, but you know, the different things. And I think for us, it's about thinking about, it's taking a holistic approach to the services and the support and the work that people are offering, and that's at agency level, to local government, national government, and then right down into the community level of groups and organizations, and really being sort of looking at the case studies, which we do see. You know, I know you're saying sort of mid-steeple quarter, but actually I think, and SURF's been great at highlighting some of the amazing work that's happening, you know, across Scotland. I think telling the story of what this looks like and telling the challenges, like Graham and Angie have been talking about, then highlights, okay, well, why are we struggling with capacity when actually, you know, third sector offers this, or this group offers this, or that group offers this. And often I think there's you know, the barriers might be in confidence, they might be in walking into a space, they might be in even knowing what's possible or knowing what that next step is. But so in telling those stories of how work has happened, I think that's really valuable. And learning each other's language is really, really important, you know, because, for example, I've been talking to sort of digital innovation recently. I feel like somebody's talking, you know, Arabic to me, and it's wonderful. I know there's a real connection, but currently I'm like, I don't know what this is, you know. So we need to learn each other's languages and find those spaces and those bridges. Somebody talked about bridges. I think it might have been Graham, you know.
Thanks very much, Kath. Now, Beth, you've got your hand up, and I know you mentioned the TSIs in the chat.
Yes, I just wanted to sort of expand on that a little bit, in terms of what TSIs offer. You know, we do offer capacity building training. We have generally, certainly in the Scottish Borders, extremely strong connections with the local community. We're sort of first port of call that when a person comes forward with an idea, how do I take this forward? How do I set up a new group? You know, what are the different legal structures out there? How do I access funding? Where can I go? Can you review this funding application for me? To running networking events, and to being a voice for the community sector, to local and national government, and also becoming aware of the sort of plethora of different national organisations that are out there to support with specialist remits, and to plug local groups in with them. I quite often describe the third sector interfaces as general practitioners, really, like a GP surgery, where you could go in with any community issue and they would know the specialist to send you to if they couldn't sort of help you themselves. So you know, I think there's definitely work to be done in sort of raising awareness amongst other national organisations of the work of the TSI network, but it's just very extremely relevant in this space. And if I may just briefly, to the project that I'm on at the moment is funded through the Shared Prosperity Fund, that we applied to our Scottish Borders Council for the funding to support local place plans, community-led planning. So you know, we are working on the ground practically to resource that and to encourage groups to get involved in all of this, and to support them hands-on through the process and have some funding available, which is easy for them to access and draw down on. So, you know, we are actively engaged in this space as well as a third sector interface.
Thanks very much, Beth. That was really great. Rob?
couldn't find the hand raise button either. I think Beth makes an excellent point. I mean, this is an ecosystem, right? We all need each other. You know, SoSE's communities team isn't big enough to do everything in the region. The TSIs are doing their work in Borders and Dumfries and Galloway respectively, and it's brilliant work. You know, there's space for all of us, and actually we're all needed. The trick is, and I think Graham made a really important point about systems change. I think it is systems change over time, absolutely, and it's really, really necessary. We need to put our heads together collectively to work out how we change the systems so that Angela's next brilliant idea is easier to do than the last one. And I think every time we manage to score that, we get a step further forward and we're doing a bit better, which is probably like a much quicker, easier way of saying what I tried to do in 15 minutes. But I genuinely think as a measure of success, that's probably a pretty good one. And collectively, I honestly believe we can all make it happen. And I do think that the creative placemaking approach potentially is a really important role to play in that in the future. Thanks, you.
And Rob, I would echo the fact, I think that's one of the things we consistently hear, I suppose, some of the projects that we find both through the Surfer Awards and through this network is how we make it, communities get through, there's challenges and they're the repeated challenges. And it's actually, there are often challenges that actually the private sector faces as well, through planning, through utilities, all that sort of thing. But how we make some of those things easier to happen, to smooth out some of the challenges. Graham.
Yeah, and just my final point, or a plea that speaks of what Catherine said and what Rob said there, links back to language and an approach. And I know there'll be major or senior decision makers in this room and people who you'll know that's major decision makers in systems. And for me, it starts with like that just approach to kind of not use no as a first thing. Like it doesn't always have to be a yes, but maybe it just starts with can we? Now that might arrive in a no, but even just that first of not automatically going to a no because of something, even just that commitment to explore the can we, maybe is enough to instigate some level of minor systematic change in each organisation or decision-making process that then snowballs into something. So not always a yes, but let's maybe not use no as often as we hear.
That's great, Graham, and a really good piece of advice. And Angie, it looks like you were about to say something.
Yes, but I don't know kind of if it's actually got to be relevant to what you're speaking about now.
It's going to be.
If you look at where we started, again, without our local housing, so at the time it was DGHP, they gave us our constitution. I had no idea about constitutions. So they gave us the advice and gave us a copy of their constitution that we were able to copy with that. Then it went into meeting someone from the council. It was the community director was doing his ward visits. He then seen the potential of lift, and through the council, we were then able to get an asset transfer. We wouldn't have been able to get that asset transfer if it wasn't for third sector. Third sector and Just Enterprise sat down with us and done a business plan. I've no background whatsoever in doing a business plan, and they went through it. But again, it goes back to language. They spoke to me and says, tell us what lift is, and then we will write it in the buzzword language that it needs to be coherent for a business plan. So we would never have got to that stage without the third sector. Then we move on my local council. And again, Derek Hextall is a ward officer that works with us. He was instrumental in like giving us advice and keeping us legally working and stuff. And then obviously the Stove Network, they've been with me for the very, very beginning. I'd never have got to where I am now without their support and their knowledge. Knowledge is massive, and we needed that because again, my background, I was just a young mum. And then again to Wheatley, without them actually seeing Lift's vision, we would never have got the cabin, we would never have got the licence to occupy ground. I had no idea about licence to occupy. It was Graham that's got all that technical brain. So without all these different organisations coming together, Lift probably wouldn't be as successful as it is now, because now I've got an asset transfer, I own a local shop, and I employ 8 local people that have all came from social backgrounds of like serious social issues that are not there now, and like they're off medication and everything because of us having belief in them and them building on their own personal development. And again, I wouldn't have had that without Sleeping Giants telling me about training and all this stuff. So it does take all these different organisations and all this different knowledge speaking to each other. And the one thing that I find very productive for me as a person is face-to-face meetings. So when Catherine put together the No One Place and everybody came into that room together, that was amazing. This Zoom is fantastic, but it's a wee bit daunting because I can't see people's reactions because they're not on camera. And now I'm actually shaking, even though they've spoke all morning. But it really is beneficial for a small community group to turn into one of the biggest anchor organisations. Thanks, pal! One of the biggest anchor organisations in Northwest Dumfries. And as people can see, I'm now speaking to people nationally, which I never thought coming from Lochside would ever have been possible for me. But thanks to all used people coming together, this is something that have gave me the opportunity to do. So thanks.
Thanks very much, Angie. And Angie, you've ended the meeting totally on a high and an excellent note, because I suppose what you said is that all those agencies, the local authority, the housing association, they've all been enabling for you. They've all provided a supportive, and I think that comes back to some of the earlier questions that we had from people who maybe work in local authorities, is what can we do? And it's about enabling people, which comes to your point, Graham, of not beginning with no, and maybe saying, can we do this, and being able to explore it, which is the kind of the creative process. It's been a totally rich morning. We've had really lovely responses in the chat. All the slides will be shared, the chat will be shared, and the recording will be shared with you all, so you can share it with colleagues. All I can do is express how grateful we at Surf are for all of you, Rob, Catherine, Graham, and Angie, and all the people who have given questions, for giving your time to us this morning, because we're not paying you for this, but you're sharing your information with a wider network, which will, I think, people will result in visiting. Hopefully people will come for the next big event in Lochside. But thank you very much for all that you've shared with us this morning, and we look forward to seeing you all again. And thank you very much to everyone for joining us today. And what is maybe of slight interest, or not slight interest, but our next event, we'll probably be looking at some of the things with Alistair Clements from Inch Architecture that Graham touched on, about when communities begin planning projects, barriers that you may come up against, and we'll look forward to seeing you all in 2 months' time. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.